Thank you all for being here and giving me the opportunity to speak to you. For those of you who don't know, I was the Vice President for Communications at Brookings for just about 6 years, from 2012 until 2018. And prior to that, had a career that was mostly in the campaign space, both some traditional political campaigns, but heavy on the issue campaigns, and had a specific focus from about 2005 on in the use of digital to grow audiences, primarily around the purposes of raising awareness or creating some sort of change. So I was asked to speak today, when I talked to John, to give the unvarnished view of things. I think the idea was that because I'm no longer at a think tank, that I might be willing to say some things that I wasn't otherwise willing to say. And I kind of laughed at that because clearly John doesn't know me very well. Holding my tongue is not something I've ever been particularly good at. As a former colleague who's here today, who I want to acknowledge, Ashley Schelling, can attest to. Ashley's sitting over there, and I'm extremely happy to see her. She was always one of my favorite people to work with at Brookings. I miss not working with you. And she is an amazing person when it comes to digital engagement, and could probably tell you more than I ever could specifically about social and email, and a variety of other things that have gone on at Brookings. So I just want to acknowledge her. So truthfully, I accepted this opportunity because I wanted to see some old friends, most of whom I think I've already talked to, of those that I know, and also see who's new in the space that I don't know. So I'm happy to be here. I thought today that I would talk primarily about impact. It's something that was never clearly defined at Brookings, and I suspect for many of you who think about impact, for those of you that do, it's probably not terribly clearly defined for you either. For those of you that it is, I'd be curious to hear about that. More specifically, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about my experience at Brookings, and then get into a sense of where I think the space is now from what I've been able to observe as an outsider looking in for the last year, and finally where I think things are going. And hopefully that will address the brilliant title that John came up with. When I got to Brookings in 2012, there was a very tiny digital presence and almost zero engagement with that audience in any material way. Ashley was the one person doing social media and email, I think, to the extent that we were doing any email at that time. And I remember the small office that she sat in. Didn't get I don't think you got a lot of interaction with anyone other than the immediate people who worked around you. So there was not a big focus on digital. There was just no sense of trying to reach an audience. And that was the thing that I grabbed onto and drilled into over the course of my time there. And really, I think, as I've thought about it since I left, if you boiled it down, ensuring that there was a focus on trying to reach an audience was the single biggest thing. It was at the heart of everything that I did during my time at Brookings. In general, we tried to do three things. We tried to improve the digital presentation of the content. So, we'll talk about some other think tank examples, but the Brookings essay, for those of you who are familiar with that, would be one example. We tried to improve audience engagement with that content. So the work with social media, the work with creating the Brookings Brief email. Those are just two examples, and I could list more. And we made brand plays to improve the visibility and profile of the brand. So a partnership that we did with Esquire magazine, partnerships that we did with the New York Times, a film that we made just before the end of my time there, and a partnership we did with Variety magazine. Those were all primarily brand plays. To accomplish that, we started with a list of values and a list of what I like to call the rules of engagement. And rules of engagement is something I took directly from my campaign days. In in that life, in political campaigns, I refer to them as strategic assumptions. Another way to think of them is rules to live by. So I'll run through them just because it was useful for me to go back and look at them again, and maybe it'll be useful for you. So in terms of values, these were the 5 that we wrote down, or that I wrote down. We strive for the highest quality in all communications. We are audience focused. We prioritize strategic choices over other considerations whenever possible. And that's because, as you all know, there's a lot of other considerations that come into play when making decisions about what to publish, how to publish it, when to publish it, what to do with it. We are innovative. That was something that I focused on a lot with our team, was making sure that we were constantly asking, what new could we be doing? What aren't we doing that we should be doing? And we are iterative. And this was a big one, was I believe that we were never going to get something right the first time, so we had to do it and then learn what we could and then do it again and then learn what we could and then do it again. In terms of the strategic assumptions or the rules to live by, these are things that you assume to be the case about the world that you're operating in. Number 1, we exist to add value to the work of Brookings, its programs, and its scholars. That was perhaps, I think, maybe a unique thing to Brookings, but probably not. Our job was, we weren't promoting it ourselves, right? We were promoting the work of the scholars. Number 2, and this was a big one for me, our current audience is global, social, and mobile, right? So remembering that Brookings was trying to reach people all over the world, that they were on social, and that they were primarily accessing the content through their mobile devices. We had to remember that when we were producing content and when we were distributing content. Third, the process of creating more opportunities for impact is evolutionary, not revolutionary, right? That goes to the iterative process, right? The idea that if we were going to create impact, we were going to do something, learn from it, and do it again. We were not going to be transformational in terms of what we did. Fourth, we can't do everything or help everyone inside of Brookings. We have to prioritize. And that's more of a political thing than an editorial thing, right? It's that when you work inside a big institution like Brookings, there's a lot of different pressures to do a lot of different things. And so, you have to prioritize what you're able to do. And that was a way of sort of keeping our sanity. And finally, the value of the content, the effectiveness of the targeting, and the manner and means of a piece of content's delivery all contribute to its relevance. So I used to say relevance is a product of the quality of the content times the effectiveness of its distribution, right? And this is sort of a variation on that. It adds in the actual production of the content as well. But as many of you may have encountered, I'm assuming, in a think tank environment, a lot of times, no offense to the scholars at all, they're brilliant and they do great work. They tend to think that, if they just write something and they write it well, that the world will listen. And so one of the things I tried to bring to the table was, it's not just how brilliant your work is, it's also how well it's packaged and how well it's distributed. And I tried to preach that at board meetings and, at senior staff meetings and so forth, to make that part of the culture in the organization. And I think to some extent, I succeeded. Ashley could speak to that maybe better than I could. The statistical improvement was clear over the time that I was at Brookings, regardless of what metric you used. But the question I had at the end of it was whether or not ultimately it was enough if the final goal was achieving impact. And I'm going to come back to that. Before I do that, I want to point out some other excellent examples of content development and distribution, because I don't want to make it just me talking. I don't want to just highlight stuff that Brookings has done. So one that I wanted to mention was the Peterson Institute's What is Globalization microsite. Steve Weissman and I remained friends, and I was familiar with this. I have really been impressed. And I understand, I don't know your name, I'm sorry. Melina. I understand Melina is responsible for this excellent piece of work, and so I want to acknowledge her. For those of you who've not seen it, it's just tremendously well put together. Everything, I shouldn't scroll too quickly, but maybe the nav bar gives you a sense of how comprehensive and in-depth this package is. Really, you can, if you go through this, you're going to know everything you want to know about globalization, and it's presented, the material, if you go through it in detail, which we won't do now, is presented beautifully. So I think, given, if I might say, given where the Peterson Institute was in 2012 or 2013, it's remarkable that this piece of content came out of the Peterson Institute from a digital perspective. And I just think it's fantastic. I can't speak because I didn't look to how it's been distributed. Fantastic. There you go. There you go. So I think it's a great piece of content. Another one that I want to mention is the CSIS China Power package. Which, who's here from CSIS? No one? Okay. Unlike Melina, who had to tell us that it's #1 on Google, if you scroll down to the bottom, they've got it. So, you know all the awards that they won. I thought that was interesting. That's not something I think we ever would have done at Brookings under Strobe, put our awards at the bottom of a page. But it is an excellent, it's a really excellent package. And you can see they've got the podcast looped in. And likewise, as I said about the other one, if you go through and you actually look at the content, it's beautifully presented, it's beautifully put together. In terms of email, two that I would mention, I'm not going to bring them up because it wouldn't really show much anyway, is Aspen's Best 5 Ideas is one that I like. I like that one because, who's here from Aspen? Anybody? I think it's, what's your name? Danielle. I think it's, I like it because I think it's bold to be bringing in ideas from other places and not just promoting your own. And I think that provides a service to the people who are following you. I also like Andrew's The Evening email product from CSIS, for those of you who are familiar with that and who see that. I think that's a good product. In terms of podcasts, Trade Talks from Peterson, I think is really excellent. And the CNAS podcast. Anybody here from CNAS? Okay, the CNAS podcast is strong and performs well on iTunes if you look at the rankings. So those are just some that I would check out in terms of other products that are good from a digital perspective. It's an email product, the Best 5 Ideas. You can sign up for it on their website. Now, where do I think things are right now? I think that the model of think tanks as a source of information within policy circles is under attack like never before. And I'd welcome ideas once I'm done talking as to people who disagree with me on that. I'll give 3 examples of what I mean. And this is something that I talked about really going back to 2012, and I feel like it has come to pass. First example is just looking at what places like Axios and The Atlantic, among others, are doing with events. Those events look and sound very much like think tank events. And in fact, I would argue that if you took a promo, a flyer or whatever, or a web link from an Axios event or an Atlantic event, and you took out the branding of who they were, I think you'd have a hard time distinguishing whether or not they were a think tank event. The New York Times and Vox, among others, do excellent explainer videos. I think as good or better than anything that think tanks are producing. And finally, as a third example, and this is one that's a little bit more out of left field, but something that I've been paying attention to, Netflix and Amazon Prime increasingly host documentaries on a wide variety of subjects, some of which dig quite deep into policy issues and which should be taken seriously. And this is part of the explosion in documentary filmmaking, which has taken place because of the over-the-top services. It's something that I dealt with a lot when I was making a documentary towards the end of my time at Brookings. And I think it's only going to continue. There is a more of a thirst. There's more of a way to place this content. One way to deal with these challenges is to partner with media organizations, which most think tanks have done. I'm sure all of you have done at one point or another. The problem with that with media partners in general is that they want the scholars from think tanks. They don't really want the think tank brand. They just want the scholars from the think tanks. And often our scholars are more than willing to appease them in that, more than willing to go on. And the brand of the think tank may not necessarily benefit from that. So the model of think tanks as a source of information for influencers still has its place. But the problem is that the influencers have diversified their sources of information the same as everybody else, if perhaps not to the same degree. So even if you are not interested in reaching a wide audience, even if you just want to reach Capitol Hill staff, you still to some extent have the same problem. The diversification of information that they're getting is still an issue. Think tanks were never well positioned for this problem because historically, we have not tried to build audiences. But now we live in a world where the size of your audience and has a dramatic effect on your ability to be able to deliver information. 20 years ago, if you're a Hill staffer, it didn't matter if a think tank had a big audience. But now, because of where they're getting their information, it does. Media outlets do have that big audience. And what's interesting is they are aggressively fighting for more. In retail, and I used to work on retail business issues 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there is a term category killer. When retail outlets like Walmart get big enough, they start going after smaller and smaller categories of the market. Now you would think the sort of natural inclination is to think that if something gets really, really large, they're not going to care about smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of market share. But that's exactly what happens. It's counterintuitive. That's exactly what happens, is that the bigger that something gets, the more that they gobble up smaller and smaller pieces of market share because they're still looking to grow and they've got to go to smaller and smaller pieces to grow. That's how you get rid of bookstores. That's how you get rid of auto parts stores. That's how you get rid of sporting goods stores and so on. I see the same thing happening in media right now. The New York Times and the Washington Post have gotten so large, and those are just two. We could name a handful of others, I'm sure, but those are just two. They've gotten so large that they are going after increasingly smaller and smaller pieces of market share. So that's why, one of the reasons why you see them moving into deeper and deeper policy niches or doing things which look more and more like what think tanks do. So what's the answer? In my opinion, it's not more distribution because, people used to ask me all the time at Brookings, are you trying to compete with the New York Times? And I would say, no, that would be crazy, right? I can't compete with the New York Times. But I would say, but we are all competing for someone's attention. And that's what you're trying to do. So first, I think you don't abandon partnerships, which I'm sure many of you are doing, media partnerships. But you do have to make sure you maintain your own identity. One thing that I would always do at Brookings was I would insist on, a link to the Brookings brand at the top of the piece, particularly the scholars page, and other ways of making sure that the content could link back to Brookings so that people knew that it wasn't just, a particular scholar writing for that outlet, but it was a scholar writing for that outlet as a Brookings scholar. Second, I think we have to get better. I think the industry has to get better about identifying audience, really knowing who we are trying to reach in a given case and how we are going to reach them and with what. I'm sure some of you do that quite well. I'm sure there's a wide degree of variance between who does it well and who doesn't do it well. I don't think we ever did it particularly well at Brookings, to be honest, primarily because 100 scholars, each with different projects and different products, each trying to reach different audiences. It was hard to develop any kind of cohesion around who are we trying to reach, how are we trying to reach them, what are we delivering? And I think that this is one where a degree of centralization does help. And so those of you that work in places that are more centralized, I think it's easier to do that. Third, I think comms people need to have a seat at the table in selecting what projects get done. And I realize this is a pie in the sky thing, and this is a thing of me not being in the process anymore. But It's something I fought for when I was there. It's something that I still think was valuable. I think comms people, part of the culture of the organization has to be that comms is at the table to discuss what are we doing and why are we doing it and how is it going to affect the world. Otherwise, it's just about what can we raise money for and what is the scholar interested in, and then handing it off to the comms person to try to figure out how you promote it. That's certainly what happens. But, if we're here to talk about how could the world be better, I think it'd be better if comms people had more of a seat. So I hope some of you do. I hope some of you are sitting there thinking, well, I have that. We didn't necessarily have that at Brookings. And that's it. That's it. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions. And was that? Oh, that was a half an hour? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Thanks.